Welcome back to The Explainer. Today we're going to try something absolutely wild. We are attempting the impossible. We're taking the entire, sprawling, completely chaotic relay race of human civilization and condensing it into a breathless, rapid-fire journey. Seriously, based on our incredible source material, we're going to trace the lines from ancient stargazers all the way up to the brink of modern global conflict.
Okay, let's dive into this. Consider our agenda your time traveler's itinerary. First up, we'll look at the birth of first civilizations, move right into ancient empires and ideas, transition to faith, conquest, and connection, chart a quick course through the age of exploration, and finally crash right into revolutions and the modern world.
All right, Section 1, Birth of First Civilizations. Our story actually kicks off between two rivers in ancient Iraq. Here, the Sumerians were incredibly busy inventing writing and, get this, mapping out the very hours and minutes that you and I still use today. Priests were literally watching star constellations to figure out how time works.
Now, what's really fascinating here is just how fast human ambition took over. Up until this point, pretty much every city had its own king. But a ruler named Sargon looked at that setup and thought, well, that's incredibly inefficient. According to our sources, his philosophy was brutally simple. Kings don't rule for the benefit of the people. They rule to increase their pride, power, and possessions. And by conquering neighboring cities, Sargon built the first empire. This sparked a massive global trend. Suddenly, the Egyptians were building pyramids, the Minoans were painting these elaborate frescoes, and over in the Indus River Valley, people were laying out highly organized cities with perfectly straight roads. As all these civilizations grew, so did the need to communicate. Now, you might think the alphabet was some grand monumental invention carved into a temple wall somewhere, right? Actually, scratch that. One of our earliest records of it is on an ancient Canaanite lice comb, literally a comb for lice. The Phoenicians were the ones who really popularized this system. They took their word for ox, which was olive, and their word for house, bet, put those initial sounds together to get ab, meaning father. And suddenly you have a game changer, a system where letters represent sounds, not just pictures. Alphabet. Alphabet. It was such a genius idea that everyone copied it. It's the whole foundation for exactly how we read and write today.
That brings us right to Section 2, Ancient Empires and Ideas. As the Bronze Age collapsed, a quiet revolution of thought just exploded globally. We're talking Cyrus the Great in the Middle East to Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, and Confucius and Laozi over in the East.
Let's move east for a second and see how this builds in China. Because while empires in the West were constantly shattering and being completely replaced by different cultures, China's history is marked by this incredible, persistent continuity. We can trace a timeline of overlapping successive dynasties, the Shang, the Zhou, the Qin, the Han. Sure, sometimes there was one unified China, and sometimes it fractured into like 16 pieces, but that cultural through line remained incredibly strong. They were innovating at lightning speed, inventing paper, printing, and even building massive walls to control their borders.
And you know, speaking of Chinese innovation, we have to look at a rather surprising historical contrast. Usually when we compare ancient empires, we talk about their militaries. But let's look at their hygiene for a second. The Chinese were actually the first to invent and use toilet paper. Contrast that with the mighty Roman Empire. They used sponges attached to sticks, or the Greeks who used broken pieces of clay pots. Ouch. Just a little historical perspective to make you really appreciate the modern era, right? Back over in the West, the Greeks were super busy inventing democracy, fighting off the Persians at Marathon, and creating this incredible lineage of thought. It's like a relay race. Socrates taught Plato, Plato taught Aristotle, and Aristotle, well, he tutored a kid named Alexander. So the crucial takeaway here is that this chain of philosophy directly armed Alexander the Great with the tactical and cultural mindset to basically take revenge on the Persians and conquer the entire known world. Of course, then he died and his generals immediately fought each other and carved up the scraps of his empire.
Moving into Section 3, Faith, Conquest, and Connection. Out of the total chaos of the Greek world, Rome rose to incredible, unprecedented power. But right at the peak of their empire, a man named Jesus emerged in the Middle East, setting off a total ideological earthquake. What followed was easily one of the most unexpected twists in history. A man named Paul, who originally made his living hunting Christians, claimed to see Jesus and completely flipped, beginning to spread the faith globally. The Romans responded with brutal persecution. We're talking feeding believers to lions, burning them alive, the whole 9 yards. But here's the wild paradox. This extreme persecution actually backfired. It served as the ultimate proof of conviction, which ended up making the movement wildly popular. The idea spread like wildfire until eventually the Emperor Constantine just embraced it, and a council was held to unify their beliefs. It completely transformed the Roman Empire.
Centuries later, a similarly massive shift happened down in the Arabian Peninsula. For hundreds of years, Arab clans had been locked in these brutal, never-ending internal fights. That changed entirely when Muhammad brought forth the revelations of Islam. By uniting the Arabs under one faith, he effectively put a stop to the internal clan wars. But with that internal peace came an absolute outward explosion of energy. They expanded rapidly, creating an empire larger than literally any before it, which pretty quickly ended up clashing with Christian Europe.
The Middle Ages that followed were just a chaotic domino effect of migration and warfare. You've got Vikings exploring, raiding, and settling everywhere from Russia to North America. You've got the Seljuk Turks conquering the Byzantines, which prompts the Pope to call for the Crusades, a brutal series of holy wars. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, Genghis Khan and the Mongols sweep across Asia, conquering twice as much territory as Alexander the Great. And if all that wasn't enough, the Black Death arrives, wiping out a full third of Europe's entire population.
From the ashes of the plague, we enter Section 4, the Age of Exploration. The Renaissance kicks off. Gutenberg invents the printing press. The Spanish Inquisition happens, and Europe desperately needed a reset. This led to a massive push for wealth and new tech that pushed explorers like Columbus out into the great unknown.
But here's the thing, what Columbus stumbled upon was definitely not empty land. Native Americans had been there for millennia, building massive, complex empires of their own. The Spanish arrived and ruthlessly conquered the deeply established Aztec and Inca empires, who, by the way, also loved building pyramids. The Spanish plundered absolutely incredible amounts of gold, silver, and new crops to send back home. Meanwhile, the Portuguese successfully sailed all the way around Africa to Asia, building a massive trading empire that totally bypassed the ancient Silk Road.
And this brilliantly illustrates the dark, mechanical engine that drove this new global economy. It was a cold, brutal cycle. Portuguese traders would sail ships full of European goods to Africa and trade them for enslaved people. They would then transport those enslaved humans to the Americas to be traded for food and resources. Those resources were shipped back to Europe and traded for more goods. Rinse and repeat. It was a terrifyingly efficient triangle of human commodification that completely reshaped the world.
Back in Europe, the religious unity of the Middle Ages was completely shattering. Thanks to Gutenberg's printing press, a German priest named Martin Luther basically went medieval viral, sparking the Protestant Reformation. Over in England, though, the Reformation happened for a very different reason. King Henry VIII just wanted a divorce. When the Pope said no, Henry simply broke away and started his very own church. This religious fracturing fueled the rise of new, fiercely competitive naval powers in northwestern Europe, particularly the Dutch and the English.
This intense global competition brings us to our final section, Revolutions and the Modern World. As European powers raced to colonize the Americas, massive global conflicts ensued, leaving empires like Britain with just crippling national debt.
So picture this. King George III and his ministers are staring at empty coffers, trying to figure out how on earth to pay off this mountain of debt. A British statesman named George Grenville came up with a seemingly simple solution: tax the Americans. They figured, hey, the colonies should pay for the war that was fought on their soil, right? Well, it was a deeply fateful decision.
The direct cause and effect here is incredibly straightforward. The Americans absolutely despised these new taxes. So they rebelled, threw a bunch of tea in the harbor, and had a revolution. But to win, they needed help. France, eager to get revenge on the British, jumped in to support the Americans. Together, they actually beat the British. But history loves irony because fighting this war dragged France into the exact same massive debt that Britain had just faced.
Which leads us to this perfect historical rhyme. King Louis XVI of France looks at his completely empty treasury and asks his Minister of Finance, Charles Alexander de Calonne, what they should do. Calonne's brilliant idea? Tax the people. The very same logic that lost Britain its American colonies was now being applied right inside France.
And the result was exactly the same, but far more bloody. The French people didn't like the taxes, so they had a revolution. They overthrew the monarchy, which paved the way for a general named Napoleon to seize power and basically conquer most of Europe. This whole thing sparked a wave of revolutions across Latin America and fundamentally shifted the world order as Britain, desperately trying to stay ahead, kicked off the Industrial Revolution with steam power.
As these newly industrialized European powers looked to expand in the 19th century, they turned their eyes to Africa. They justified their scramble for Africa by claiming Europeans were scientifically the fittest to rule. But this conveniently ignored the complex reality. The continent was already occupied by incredibly rich, diverse societies. I mean, just look at this staggering list of established empires, from Egypt and Kush to the builders of Great Zimbabwe and the Zulus. But the European powers ignored this entirely, launching a brutal, hyper-competitive race to carve up the continent.
And that brings us to the terrifying reality of the early 20th century. You have these massive global empires, Britain, France, Germany, Russia, and they are all aggressively expanding. But more importantly, they are now armed with terrifying new industrial technologies. We're talking telegraphs, airplanes, massive battleships, and submarines. The problem? The map is full. There is literally nowhere left to expand, except perhaps picking off pieces of the crumbling Ottoman Empire.
So, we end our rapid-fire journey with this provocative question. You have a literal pressure cooker situation. The globe is entirely carved up. Massive, hyper-competitive empires are pushing against borders that can no longer stretch, and their armies are equipped with the deadliest technologies human beings have ever invented. What happens when they finally, inevitably, crash into each other? Well, that is a story for our next explainer. Thanks for joining me on this incredible sprint through history.